Crusaders. My name is Brooke Plack, and I am your host here today on the Grit Crusade podcast. And I'm so excited to be here with you today. So if it's your first time tuning in, welcome to the channel. And if you've been here before, welcome back. Today, we are kicking off a brand new mini-series. This will actually be the second mini-series I've done. So the first mini-series was a work-life flow mini-series. And so if you haven't watched that, we'll be sure and link that in the notes on the show notes so that you can go back and check that one out. This mini-series is a little bit deeper, a little bit more of the nitty-gritty, getting real in the trenches, right? So Grit Crusade stands for getting real in the trenches. And we talk about life, relationships, and business, which affects almost all of us, right? And so today we're going to kick off a mini series about defense mechanisms. I know. And so you may see me looking more at my notes today if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening online on your favorite podcast streaming platform, it won't be any different to you. But for those of you that do tune in on YouTube, welcome as well. But if I'm looking at my notes a little bit more, it's because I am not a psychologist. And so you'll see references in the show notes on these episodes about where I'm getting the research from, because I wanted to make sure that I did due diligence in pulling authentic, real information into these episodes, even though this may not be my actual area of expertise. I did get a minor in psychology in my undergrad. So maybe that somewhat qualifies me. I don't know. But these are definitely things that show up in our life, in our relationships, and in our leadership journeys and business. And so in this 4-part mini-series, we're going to be tackling 8 different defense mechanisms. So if you go on Google and it says, you Google defense mechanisms or how many defense mechanisms there are, you may find a list that has 10. You may find a list that has 20. You may find a list that has 6 or 8. So I've narrowed it down to ones that I have seen in my leadership journey and in my relationships show up the most frequently, and also are often ones that are hard to identify. And so it's really easy for us to start talking about psychology and start talking about something like defense mechanisms and start pointing the finger. And that is what I don't want for us to do throughout this mini series. Is we're not trying to listen to this through ears of, oh, that's my spouse, or that's my kid. We're trying to listen to it through ears of compassion, not only for others, but also for ourselves. Because as we start to unearth these things in ourselves, we can grow into who it is we were truly designed to be. But until we start realizing how we are processing the world around us, then we're always going to have these shields up and not really be able to be authentic and connect as well as we could with others. So today's defense mechanisms that we're talking about are displacement and intellectualization. Yeah, say that 3 times fast, right? All right. In our second episode, it will be denial and avoidance. Our third episode and fourth episode will head into several others as well. So we'll talk about those as we get closer to the end of the show. But for today, we're going to talk about displacement and intellectualization, right? They're probably the longest word with the most syllables, multisyllabic word. There's my old English teacher coming out with fancy words there. So displacement is similar to some other defense mechanisms, but I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So this is this is definitely a defense mechanism I've seen come up recently in my life and the circle of people around me. Okay. So here's the first example that you may be able to connect with displacement, because that's the first one we're going to tackle today. Your boss yells at you at work, but rather than confront her and stand up for yourself, you pick an unrelated fight with your partner or spouse at home that evening. So you are displacing that emotion from one situation to another. Okay, here's another one. You are a caregiver for an elderly relative with no end in sight. They're not about to kick the bucket, right? Rather than seek a community of caregivers to gain tools and resources to process these difficult emotions in your life, you begin to resent your friends that are not caregivers. So the displacement, rather than resenting the person you're taking care of and processing those emotions, is now being displaced onto friends who are not even related to the situation. The American Psychology Association tells us that people use defense mechanisms unconsciously to prevent or release negative thoughts and emotions. And although it may be helpful in your present emotional state, it can lead to big problems down the road because we start to lean on these other kind of automatic tools within us rather than feel the feelings that we're actually feeling. Right? I know. I talked about how we're going to talk about avoidance and denial in the next episode. And those are things I think that are maybe easier to recognize than displacement for sure. So one of the websites I used for some of my research is called consciousrethink.com. And so they have divided types of displacement into several different categories. And so we're not going to dive into every single bucket that they had separated it into, but consciousrethink.com definitely a place you can go if you want to get more information. But we will talk about a couple of the types of displacement and how those can show up in our lives, and then do our trivia in the trenches. So if you're new here, you'll love that segment. Today's question is really fun. And then talk about intellectualization. So let's jump into these different types of displacement that can happen as a defense mechanism to the emotions that we're experiencing in our lives and our leadership journeys. So the first type is called unrelated transfer. Okay. So we're going to take you back to your college days, unless we have some college listeners here. And rather than devote time studying, you go out partying with friends. And a couple of days later, you do poorly on an important test. But rather than acknowledging that you were insufficiently prepared, you blame it on the professor's questions. You can't confront the professor. So you go to the gym and you start hammering away at one of those punching bags, and there's a line of people waiting behind you for their turn. And instead of moving and giving them a turn, which is like courteous behavior, you stay on that punching bag just to be an ass. So now, instead of actually dealing with the emotions you're feeling of failure and failing that test, you're blaming it on the professor and transferring it to the people that are waiting in line for the punching bag. Has that shown up in your life? What about this one? Direct transfer. So we've got the unrelated transfer of your emotions or displacing those emotions. What about the direct transfer? You planned all week to clean out the garage with your partner, but the weekend comes and for legitimate reasons, your partner is called into work. You can't fault them because it's out of their control, right? And you don't want to create like any unnecessary drama, but you've been wanting to get it done for ages. So instead, on Monday at work, you're really snippy and ugly with some of your coworkers. And you've just decided that, it's okay because everyone can be in a mood every once in a while. That is a direct transfer. So you're still transferring that emotion of frustration, but you're still not dealing with the feelings you're actually feeling about not getting the garage done, whether with yourself or talking to your partner or spouse about it. Okay. Displaced denial is the next type of displacement. So denial is its own form of a defense mechanism that we're going to talk about on episode 2 of this mini series. But in this instance, we're talking about how you can displace the denial. Okay. And it comes across very passive aggressive in the expression of like, well, I didn't want that anyway. So for example, let's say that you're up for a big promotion at work or a profit sharing opportunity and you don't get it, but rather than processing the emotions and rather than actually like asking yourself, why didn't I get that? What about my work performance is leading to this? You decide that you didn't want it anyway. And that's not, it's a lie you're telling yourself, right? Because you did want that. And now you're letting yourself believe this lie and it's getting in the way of your career goals and your progression in life about what you want. And so the hard part about the denial is that the people getting hurt by that is you. And so if you're able to see this and unroot this in yourself, you can change your trajectory. But if you're not, if you're a finger pointer or believe in the lies you tell yourself of, I didn't want that anyway, then you're never going to get to a place of authenticity to be able to see yourself how you really are and be able to move on from there. Okay. All right. 2 more types of displacement for us to talk about. So I know, and I definitely know for me, I can see my younger self, some of these showing up. And then when we talk about an intellectualization, that's the one that like I'm real convicted about. So I'm going to share some personal experiences with you when we talk about intellectualization. Okay. So we've got unrelated transfer and displacement, direct transfer, displaced denial. And then the next one is innocent deception. I hate this one. It like just makes me feel dirty all over. All right. So let's say that you feel like your partner is prioritizing work over you. You may flirt with an acquaintance to get some attention. And even if the flirting isn't overt, it's a form of displacement because rather than punishing your partner for not paying attention to you, you're exacting like revenge on them without their knowledge. But you feel like it's innocent, but it's not because you're involving other people and other emotions. And so it's very, very deceptive. And so that is a type of displacement rather than addressing this with your partner and talking about how you guys can connect more authentically and like more in other ways, even though they're working a lot. You are stepping outside of that, even though you're not actually doing anything. And it can be very hurtful to your relationships. You could do that as well with business too. You know, like if you don't feel like you're getting the praise that you want, then you start talking smack to a competitor about your boss to see what they say. And you really think nothing bad's happening, but when you start involving other people in that way, it does. It leads to a trickle effect. All right. And then the last type of displacement is positive displacement. So that lends the question, well, I thought defense mechanisms, they're not always bad. And sometimes we need them for a season, but we have to be able to get to a point to where we are able to say, okay, I was doing this and I see why, like maybe I was protecting myself through the trauma in the moment, but now I need to really spend some time in therapy or meditation or journaling to work through these things. And so the last one is positive displacement, where anger and hostility are the hallmarks, right? And here's the example. A woman can't get her family to listen to her. And instead, she throws herself into art, crafting brilliant pieces to gain acclaim from others. Or a pious person displaces their sensual inclinations into the realm of culinary, right? And they become an amazing chef. Or a man who gives up his athletic ambitions in life because of his overbearing father is now donating to a community group that's helping young athletes. So it's not always bad, but it's the lack of processing the emotions in the middle that makes it start being, pretty messy. So, right? All right. So again, I'm going to tell you one more time, I'm cautioning you about pointing that finger and really thinking about how does this show up in our own lives and being able to identify that with ourselves before we start jumping into, and you will, like, that's just like human nature. You'll be able to start recognizing these defense mechanisms in the people you love and the people that you surround yourself with. But it's not like, hey, I noticed you're using this defense mechanism. It's almost about learning more about it and learning how to ask those leading questions so they can discover that in themselves, right? Okay, so before we move on to the second defense mechanism in this mini series, we're going to do trivia in the trenches. And for some reason, I think today's trivia in the trenches topic is hilarious. All right, here we go. What dictates whether a sea turtle is a male or a female? Incubation temperature. Like, what? Are you serious? Like everything you know about the birds and the bees and about, becoming a girl or a boy and chromosomes and all that. Nope. Sea turtles just depends how hot it got in here. Makes me want to, it's getting hot in here. And then it's like a girl or a boy, right? I don't know. So here's how it goes. It's called temperature dependent sex determination. Research shows that if a turtle's eggs incubate below 27.7 degrees Celsius, which is 81 degrees or so Fahrenheit, it'll be a male. But if it incubates above 31 degrees Celsius, which is like 88.8 Fahrenheit, it'll be a female. I mean, the girls are always hotter anyway, so that makes sense. But I feel like way back when in middle school, this is the dumbest statement ever and has nothing to do with our topic. But do you remember the rumor, if boys got into hot tubs, it would make their sperm swim slower or something, or like, I don't know, like I feel like something like that. So maybe it like is related in that way, except they hatch eggs and then the eggs stay there. So I don't know. Anyway, and I don't even know if that's true about hot tubs and testicles. So yeah, it's totally off topic, but here we are. Okay, we're going to jump into the second type of defense mechanism. So there's enough about, all I can think about is these sea turtles and hot tubs now. I don't know. What'd you say? Testicles. I know. I don't know. That went south quick. All right. So the next type of defense mechanism we're talking about, and we're looking at these in ourselves. We're getting real with ourselves here, even though you're going to be able to see it in other people. And this one's a little convicting for me, and it's intellectualization. Yes, I know. I feel like I have 100 examples of how I did this, especially during the pandemic. I know. Okay. So here's how it goes. It's when you are hit with a trying situation, you may choose to remove all the emotion from your responses and instead focus on the quantitative facts. You may see this strategy in a person who spends their days creating spreadsheets of job opportunities and leads after they are let go from a job. So a previous guest I had on here, Evan Willens, talked about trauma, and he is a trauma educational specialist. And he was talking about how he observed me throughout the pandemic. Like the way I was able to control what was going on and all the uncertainty was to get all the information I could about how small businesses can be successful. How do people get on unemployment? Like, how do you do all of this? That was the way I controlled it. Let me tell you the other way. And this one's kind of like dark and sickening. So suicide trigger and death trigger. I'm just going to put that out there right now. Okay. So my mother committed suicide when I was 29 years old. Okay. We actually were our family friends with the coroner and the funeral home director in the county where she died. And so I immediately told the police where to take her. I go up there, and we kind of go through like setting up all the funeral stuff, and then she wanted to be cremated. And so when someone is cremated, if there's any metal in their body, it's offered back to the family if they want the metal that's in there. And so then like the day she was cremated, I went back up there, and Rush was like, oh, well, you didn't tell me about that metal. Like she had a lot of dental work and stuff done, and like a metal bridge in there and stuff. And so like everything was very transactional, and that's how I dealt with it. And if you rewind, when I was 18 years old and my maternal grandmother died suddenly, like I was the person up there helping plan the funeral at 18 years old, and everything was very transactional. Like, what size is this going to be? What color is this going to be? It was like an event planning. Like I was planning like I would have been planning a wedding or a baby shower. There was no emotion tied to it whatsoever. And so like I have no trouble going in a funeral home and dealing with that with someone very close to me. And I think it's because my defense mechanism is like facts and information. And so what that problem that causes, yes, it helps me to survive something really hard in the moment. But like the problem later is like, you still got to deal with the trauma. Like you still have to walk through that. And so this is something that shows up for me like so much. Now, displaced emotion, I can definitely see in my younger self, like my younger teenage, much more like emotional roller coaster self. But at this season in my life, in my late 30s, intellectualization, I think, and I feel like I may discover more as we go through this mini series, because, as a podcaster, when you're talking through these topics, they're coming out of you. Like you're not just creating content for you guys to consume. It's like actually how I feel and like what I think. And so sometimes stuff comes up like it wouldn't ever any art form, but intellectualization is up there for me for sure. So here's a way to kind of identify for yourself is like if you are someone who tends to intellectualize everything. Okay. So, and first I want you to note this though, that it is actually one of the most used emotional suppression techniques and coping skills. And many therapists have noted that clients falling into this pattern, that it works like in the short term, but more often than not, it leaves you emotionally disconnected and prevents emotional, like actual legit emotional processing. And the reason I think that is because when the event is over, the funeral, the whatever, now what? Like you're busy doing all the things and then now it's over. And so then you're left with the emotions that you haven't dealt with and processed. And so here are some questions to ask yourself to see if you're like me and that this is something that you also experience. When something or someone hurts you, do you try to learn everything you can about it? Maybe you read a book or follow professionals on Instagram or try to learn all the details. When you're talking about something upsetting, is it easy for you to just lift off and and describe what is happening intellectually. This is a very common symptom in trauma survivors, and I'm a diagnosed PTSD survivor. Do you struggle with talking about emotions, but excel at problem solving and talking about intricate details? Like, I definitely think that was a younger me. Now, through lots of therapy and work later, like, I can sit here and have these hard conversations about emotions, and I'm not scared to be transparent because I really realize that we're all dealing with all our own screwed up stuff. And the more that we talk, the more that we talk. And if you've been, following my podcast, you follow me on social media or listen, like, you hear me say that over and over, that the more we are all sharing our authentic truth, the more that we are all sharing our truth, because it lets us all know that we're not alone. And that's the same thing with this. But intellectualization, just like displacement and other defense mechanisms, it's not always a bad thing. And sometimes it helps us get through those hard, moments, but it is problematic when we use it too often and in the wrong situations. And so I, giving the example of the funeral with my mom, I can definitely tell you that. So I want to give you like a real life example from collabcounseling.com. So we'll link that into the notes. I like to put extra information in here, especially when it's a topic I'm not an expert on, because everyone internalizes information differently. And you may think like, I don't know about displacement, but intellectualization, that's definitely showing up for me. And then that gives you a resource to go click on and actually look more in depth on your own, since we've got the fancy World Wide Web here. So, all right, this person's name is Anna. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story about Anna. Anna comes to therapy every week to talk about her relationships with her mother. When she was young, her mother would yell and throw things at her. She was completely unreliable and would often disappear for days at a time. And any child would obviously struggle, right, with what's happening in Anna's home. So the therapist prompts Anna to begin talking about her childhood. She shares details with the therapist in a matter-of-fact way. There's no emotion when she's sharing, and she's able to rattle off all the facts. Some people may even be convinced that Anna is not upset about the situation and she's fine. But as a trained therapist, they know that no child would actually be fine with what she endured, and there's a reason that she keeps coming back to therapy. She has read lots of books about childhood trauma, guilty, and seems to have a deep understanding of why her mother did what she did. She knows that her mom abused her because she was abused, and I find her rationalizing much of her mother, or the therapist finds her rationalizing much of her behavior. When she is asked how something made her feel or what she was experiencing, she consistently shares research with her therapist. And she talks about how hard it must be for her mother, or asks her therapist to explain why someone might struggle with this. She wants to understand, but she doesn't want to feel. Right? I know. And so I've had guests on the show that have talked about family members, and so many times we worry about how they're processing the things that were done to us. But we can only work on and fix ourselves. We cannot fix anyone else. I'm a recovering fixer, self-proclaimed and self-denounced. If you haven't listened to my divorce podcast, which will launch before this mini-series starts, I highly recommend that you go listen to that, because I was a chronic fixer. And it wasn't just intellectualization, but I can't even imagine in my 20s all the defense mechanisms I was using through my multiple divorces to not actually process and go through the hard stuff, but going around it and figuring out this and this and this and this and this, because I'm a planner. I'm like a type A person, but you still have to feel the reality of what's happening around you. And so I'm really excited about this series, but I'm going to go back to what I said before we wrap it up and say this one more time, is this mini series is created for you to begin to think about what you're doing to avoid the tough feelings in your life, because it's so easy for us to see it in others, but it is not until we look ourselves in the mirror and truly get to know ourselves that the real growth begins to happen. And so stay tuned for next week's episode of Episode 2 in our mini series of defense mechanisms, where we will dive into avoidance and denial. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Grit Crusade podcast with Brooke Plack. Our theme song is Thunder City by Lunar Ray, licensed through Soundstripe. This podcast was produced by Luminate Media Group. Thank you for listening, and we will see you on the next episode.